starting, let's see, I need to push a little button here, right now. So this is the Cult of the Dirty Cow. I'm Joe Wilson. I teach at a university 120 miles north of here, something like that. If you're interested in the slides, you can go there sometime. I'll provide that to anybody who wants it later. So the agenda for today is the following. We're going to talk about this thing called the dirty cow, this vulnerability, how it was identified, where essentially what the remediation process was for this, how it was handled or mishandled depending on how you look at it, what the real issue in the kernel was that led to this problem being exploitable, and how easy it is to exploit. Also, how hard it is to detect whether when the exploit has occurred, and how long we can expect this vulnerability to remain active. And in addition, what this whole scenario tells you about if you're a budding kernel hacker, or if you're never been interested in kernel hacking, but you might say, yeah, this could be a thing that I might be interested in. We'll look at that just a little. So I've put too much into the talk, and we'll probably talk too fast because I want to get it all in. So somewhere around 15 minutes from now, we'll have gone through 42 slides, and you'll be saying, what the, I didn't understand what that guy said. So where were you when you heard about the dirty cow? This is what everybody always asks every time, you know, this comes up in, no, okay, it doesn't. Well, anyway, I was in my house on Friday evening, the 21st of October, 2016, finishing a hectic week. I hadn't been on Twitter for a couple of days, and let me see, Hachi Sanju told me about this, and it was the topic of conversation at B-sides Jack's on the 22nd, Saturday, and there were a lot of people talking about it, and I thought, you know, this institution where I work has a lot of machines that might be susceptible to this. So on Saturday night, I thought, wonder if my sysadmins are doing anything about this. So I sent mail that night at 7:44. I said, dirty cow, clean it up ASAP. I had a link to the information about the exploit and also information about one potential patch that could take care of it. And I went to bed. And then the next morning I get at 7:34. I didn't actually read it at 7:34. I got up a little later. I got this message that said, yeah, that was all the rage on Friday. Come next week, they'll probably have something together. And I thought, you know, this sounds like the kind of thing that's a little bit too easy for this kind of laid-back attitude. So I went and looked on ExploitDB and found a great little piece of code. And I said on Sunday at 1:19, I said, that may have been all the rage on Friday, but I'm root on a machine of your choice today. And just to send it home, I said, okay, so here's what I did. I compiled this exploit example. I ran it, and I typed who am I after the # prompt, and it said root. And I said, really? And it said root, and you know, I said, okay, I better do the cleanup. But I have to say, you know, this is wonderful. Of course, this is a privilege escalation exploit. But getting root on a machine, even if it's your own machine, is still, every time I do that, it's wonderful. Unauthorized access, authorized access is the best access, or so they say. But anyway, so at 4:45, the sysadmin wrote back this, yeah. Anyway, so eventually it did get fixed, but first, how did it get found? How did they find this thing in the first place? What happened? So V3 News had the first report I saw about this. Phil Wester, I think you pronounce that. He found this vulnerability. You can go to the article. I have a link to it. I have a lot of links at the end of this talk. If you wanted all these links, definitely go to the GitHub. I'll put that back up at the end of the talk. He didn't really quite find this vulnerability. He found somebody else's full-blown exploit in the wild. So the reason he found that is he admined a server that had been doing full packet capture of every HTTP request for 3 years. And his machines got compromised, and he was trying to look through his web logs and figure out what had happened. And he found essentially that the server had been compromised through a web exploit, and this thing was the exploit. This was the code that this dropped and ran. And so he found that exploit using this copy on write. He figured out that it gave him this privilege escalation, and he reported it to Red Hat. Right? So then comes the part about handling the management of this exploit. So how long was it from discovery to patch? Well, the Linux kernel vulnerability, the CVE, was assigned in May of 2016, more than 120 days before the patch arrived and before the public announcement. And the CVE report really wasn't complete on the 23rd of October, which was the Sunday when all of this stuff was happening. So the CVE announcement had a number of sort of almost empty things that were in it. It's complete now, and you can find out a lot about this CVE online. But there was no useful information at that time. The disclosure went down like this. Right? On Thursday, the 13th of October, a week before there was a patch, well, more than a week before, Bugzilla had this report of a kernel bug saying, any unprivileged user might be able to gain write access to files that otherwise you wouldn't be able to write through memory mappings and so forth, and they might be able to increase their privilege. Right? The message here was, well, yeah, that is the Bugzilla report. Right? So on Tuesday the 18th, 5 days later, Linus Torvalds committed a patch, right, to the get user pages GUP kernel code and also a header file that reads. And in the patch, he mentions trying to fix the problem 11 years ago. You can see this is his thing. He says, oh, this was an ancient bug that we tried to fix once, but that was undone because on the S390 it caused a problem, and so the next fix undid the fix. Right? And the interesting part, though, is he says, as the VM has become more scalable, what was purely a theoretical race condition became a lot easier to trigger. So it became a big problem. So this was actually in 2005 that original patch was attempted. Right? And he gives in the message, he gives the two patch IDs, so you can find those patches. On Wednesday the 16th, a workaround was posted at Bugzilla, and that workaround applied to to a variety of Red Hat systems. It did not solve the problem. It just made the in the wild patches or the in the wild exploits unworkable, and so it didn't really fix the underlying race condition problem. And Monday 24th, the official patch for Red Hat was released, and there it is. And so the thing that somebody who wants to look at this problem and investigate it, see what it actually does, the thing they're going to want to do is they're going to want to find a vulnerable kernel and work on that. And you can look online to find what versions of various OSs are associated by looking for the CVE and various Linux kernel versions. In this particular case, I was looking for a Debian version. I ended up looking at a Jessie kernel that was exploitable by this. So how does this thing work? Right? That's what people usually want to know about. Right? So the way it works, it exploits code. The specific code in exploit.db does the following things. The first thing it does is it opens this file that it wants to write to, but it opens it with read-only permission. Right? This, and you can see this in the code, it opens up this SUID binary, which happens to be user bin password. It opens it read-only. And the next thing it does, right, is it mmaps the read-only file into memory. And if you're not familiar with mmap, what that does is it says, I want to read to a file, but I really don't want to use the file system to read that file. I'd like you to map it into memory so I can have access to it directly as if it is part of my memory. And what ends up happening is the memory pages associated with that part of memory actually are associated with the file directly. So if you write, then presumably the writes happen through the file system directly onto the file when you write those portions of memory. However, this file is mapped with the protection level of prot read, so writes should not happen to the file, and with map private. And what this does is it causes a copy on write file mapping to occur, which means that instead of the memory that you originally had that's associated with file on disk, whenever you attempt to write to it, a copy is made. And that copy then is written to, so that no longer are you're writing to the positions that are associated with the file and would cause a write to the file. You're writing to some copy that is not associated with the file. But that only happens if you attempt to write, right? So the copy on write lets you read the original pages, write to a copy, in theory. And this is where the mmap occurs with the prompt read permission of the map private attribute. So the next thing it does, this particular exploit, is it starts up 3 threads that run concurrently. There's a version of a proof of concept that only uses 2 threads because it's actually not trying to do the last thing that this does, which we'll talk about in a minute. But 2 of these threads are doing the exploitation. The 3rd thread is just waiting for them to finish, and then it's going to do something else, right? So the 2 threads that are trying to trigger the exploit are an madvise thread, and this is saying, I no longer need this mmap. I'll get into that in a minute. And a proc self mem thread that says, I'm going to write to this memory, and it does it. It writes to the memory. Right. So here are the 2 creations of the threads. Great, the madvise thread and proc self mem thread. Right. So this madvise call is going to use the advice value. Madvise is used to advise the kernel about how you want to use memory. And one of the things you can provide as advice is, I don't need this memory, which in the case of an mmap file says, you know, I'm not going to be using this memory. You can get rid of it if you want to. I don't need it. But then again, I still reserve the right to use it in the future. And if I use it in the future, please reload it. Okay? And so that's the madvise call. The other thread writes to proc self mem, which is a file interface to memory. So not only do we have some memory that's actually associated with a file, we have a theoretical file that's associated with memory, right? And so the proc file system in Linux, for those of you who are not familiar with it, what it provides is file-like interfaces to memory, right? So I write to what I think is a file, but it's implemented in the kernel as just writes to memory. So all the file system operations are implemented, but I don't have to actually hit a device. I just change memory. So I believe that the timing is right. What exactly occurs, and I haven't verified this exactly, right? That a write's going to occur after the file memory has been freed. So you send the madvise, it's going to free that up sometimes before you do this write, sometimes after you try to do the write. If you try to write before the madvise causes freeing of the memory, you're writing to a copy. If you try to write after the freeing has occurred, then what has to happen is you have to remap the file into memory and then write to it. And if you get it just right, then the remapping happens before the copy on write is created, before the copy on write attribute is set. So you end up writing to the actual mmap that is associated with the file, so the things you write get associated with the file and sent to the device. Okay. There's a, if it's not clear, I'm trying to do a lot of things in this talk. There's a good video that a guy named Live, or whose handle is Live Overflow, either it might be his actual name, I don't know. So he has a short video, about 11 minutes long, shows pretty much how this works, gives little diagrams and animations. It's cute. And so these are the 2 threads that are running, the code for the 2 threads that are running. In this thread, 1,000,000 times it sends the madvise command, or 1,000,000 times madvise needs to essentially tries to run. And this code does the writing to proc self mem. Now, what does the exploit write? Well, in this case, the program saves user bin password to a file temp back, which was what I was restoring on that day when I demonstrated this to my satisfaction that it actually worked. And it then writes, after that, it writes a metasploit exploit that spawns a bash shell to user bin password, which is set user root. So Of course, if you write a shell to a set user root program and then you execute that program, you're going to be root. So it spawns that shell with a system command. So when it runs system user bin password, all of a sudden you have a shell, and that's great. Everybody likes that, right? So one thing that people want to know when they find out about this is there a way for me to detect that this has occurred on my system? How can I detect this? Right? So the answer is maybe you can detect it. It's not that clear. It depends on your particular setup. Right? So you're welcome. But the exploitation of this race condition is there's no direct evidence that you have exploited the race condition because this is buried deep within the kernel. There's very little code associated with it. If you look at the patch, there are only a few lines of code that are changed. So there's no logging in the kernel for race conditions because nobody knows that they exist, or else they wouldn't have written the code that way to have to log it. Right? Now, the time of the file that's written will be changed, and any commands that you execute after the file is run will be logged if you have any kind of command logging. Now, most out-of-the-box Linux systems typically don't log commands. I don't know if anybody's familiar. Does anybody run audit D on their Linux boxes? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 3.5. Somebody's scratching his eye. I'll call that a 3/4. So most of you don't run that. So what you're not going to do, what you're not going to get, I mean, if you're running audit D, then, for example, let's see, I'm over here on a machine that actually has this installed. Let me var log audit. Oh, what's in there? Oh, I must not have auditing on. Oh, is that possible? Oh. Oh, it's there. Okay. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Let me tail minus F that file. Oh, I can't. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So audit log. Let me make this a little bigger and do that again. The audit log will show what commands are being run and who's running them. Tail minus F. You're supposed to show that command, dude. Auditing's not on. Okay. Well, it does show. Auditing will show for each user who executes a command what the PID is, what the UID is, essentially what the command is, and so forth. So you can find out if somebody ran something as root and root was not logged in, then you might be able to determine that these commands were executed by somebody who shouldn't have executed them. If there is any root session, or if the commands that are being run are ones that root would normally run, it might be harder to tell, right? But some level of auditing might be reasonable and might actually help you identify that an exploit had occurred. But even that is subject to change by somebody who has rootly powers. Of course, if you're sending these audit trails to a separate machine on the network, then you may identify that the auditing stopped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you might be able to figure it out. Probably not for most installations. And of course, root can cover up essentially anything that gets done. Now, how would somebody even know that this kernel race condition existed in the first place? That's the question. Well, obviously, Linus knew in 2005 because he wanted to fix it, right? So there are really two ways this happens, two possibilities for knowing about these kernel problems. One is you're a Linux page management expert. You know all about the kernel. You've discerned the existence of this race condition by modeling the potential errors and the possible event sequences in your mind, and you have discovered that you can write this code that's going to cause this problem to occur, right? That's rare, right? The other is you're smart but lazy. You found this fixed get user pages race for write access kernel patch that was issued in 2005 and then immediately rescinded, right? And you looked at the documentation about it and you said, that looks like an interesting problem. I bet I could do something with that. And so Linus may have unwittingly unleashed this problem himself, right, by providing these great instructions that say, oh, this makes get your user pages always retry write accesses, and that requires a writable follow, and this simplified the code, and it might break for some reason. Normally you end up, okay. So he explains the problem very, very well, and then a day later, this fix that he had got removed, and he didn't try to fix it again for 11 years. So somewhere between 2005 and 2016. Somebody else found out about this, or maybe Linus has been, doing something on the side. I don't know. But so there is this. This is the code that actually implements the fix. So you can see there's this little function here that just tells you about the flags that are set on this page table entry, and there's a check on, well, a different check. Can I follow around? It's not. It's a more complicated check than was there before, and I have an extra flag that I have to set. That's the entire kernel change to fix this problem, right? Now, if you want to look at where this problem is and you want to see what's going on, that's another story. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes, right? So here's a kernel bug. It was in the kernel for quite a while. Ouch. The question I have is, how long do kernel bugs like this stay undetected? What's the story on that? So if you look at two studies, there was a study by John Corbett and Case Cook, the first one in 2010, the second one in 2016. And the 2010 study, but the 2016 study, they came to the same conclusion, that kernel bugs that get reported in CVEs generally stay in the kernel for about 5 years on average, right? This doesn't account for the kernel bugs that we never find out about. We don't know how long those are in the kernel, because we never find out about them. So they could be in there for a long, long, long time, right? So in the Cook study, the more recent one, it's about 3.3 years for a bug of critical severity. Now, the critical severity is probably arbitrary code execution, something like that. I don't know if a privilege escalation like this would be considered high severity, but the high severity bugs generally last a little longer. I don't know if that's because people aren't as excited about trying to find them, or whether they're maybe more difficult to find. It's not clear to me. But that's the story on the length of staying in the kernel. Then, of course, some people will want to find out, well, how does this really work? Let me go a little deeper, see if I can find other kernel bugs and so forth and so on. If you want to manipulate the kernel to understand this condition or to find other conditions, it's not really all that difficult. It might sound like mysterious and vague and complicated. It's not. Just become a kernel hacker if you want to do this. Just do it. How do you do this? Well, the things that I did, the things that people do who want to find out about the kernel is they go find some resources. Now, there are a couple of good resources about the Linux 2.6 kernel, and you might say, well, yeah, you're telling me that Understanding Linux Kernel is a great book, and Linux Kernel Development by Robert Love is a great book, but they're old. They're from 2005, So even though these are old books about an old version of the kernel, they can be extremely useful to helping you understand how the current kernel works. You should at least consider, if you've never written any kernel code and you're interested, in getting these two resources and looking at an old Linux 2.6 kernel and sampling the books and seeing how things work, because most of the techniques are extremely similar to what's being done today. Most of the techniques have not changed that much, right? But then after you do that, then you want to go to kernelnewbies.org. This is the online source. This is the place where people go who have never hacked the kernel before. It's got a lot of information, very helpful, extremely readable and understandable and large. There used to be I think it was Kernel Chicks, to try to get women interested in hacking the kernel. There are a lot of resources out there for people who want to find out about it. So how hard is it to compile a kernel in the first place to do this kind of thing? If you've never compiled your own kernel, you know, that's okay. It's not that hard. The steps I took to instrument a dirty cow vulnerability in an attempt to track down the details of this race condition are the following. I got an old AMD 64 kernel from this mirror, and this was, by the way, this was the hardest part for me, was finding a kernel source that was susceptible to the problem. I could not find a 32-bit, an active source of a 32-bit kernel that was exploitable anymore. All of them had been updated. I did find a 64-bit kernel. Essentially, you know, there are like 10 or 12 steps you got to do. Once you get down to this place where you start running make, things get a little deep because you have to run a compile that lasts, if you're using a uniprocessor, for maybe several hours. You'll find out about the -j parameter and assign multiple CPUs so you can compile it faster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So, yeah, there are not many steps, but you can compile it, and then you have a working version of the kernel that you can modify. And then what do you do after you have that working version of the kernel that you can modify? Well, it's if you look at the debugging the Linux kernel using GDB website, they say, okay, well, the most common thing people do for debugging is they use printk. And they'll just put print statements in the kernel, and you might think, well, that sounds like what I did in my first programming class before I knew there was such a thing as a debugger. And yes, it's true. That's what you did in your first programming. And people still do that. And the reason they do that is because the second alternative is to use KGDB. And KGDB is really GDB connected to the serial port, probably on a virtual machine, of a properly prepared kernel, and it's not that hard to prepare a kernel. But then you debug the kernel almost like you debug a regular program. The difficulty is, if you're looking at race conditions, things that run a million times, you're not going to single step through a million times of execution, and you're probably not going to be able to set a condition in your debugger that's going to capture a race condition. You're probably going to have to just put print statements in the kernel. Okay, so this is unfortunately the most common debugging method for the kernel is print statements. Now, then once you've done that, you can look for events of interest, places where the dirty, the PTE dirty bit is changed, places where the copy on write occurs. And for those who are interested, I won't use the time of everybody to do this, but I do have a few things that I had set where the copy on write gets set, and have it essentially use printk. The printks go to a file in varlog and varlog kernel, and you can look in varlog and you can follow it. And of course, this particular exploit, you can modify it, but it tries to do that right a million times. And so you get a lot of print statements in there if you're looking for it, and you'll say, hey, are any of these out of order? It's a little tricky. So it's tricky. But kernel hacking is great fun for people who are problem solvers and are interested in problems like how do things work, right? So it's a good thing. Now, this vulnerability is now fixed, right? Because there are new versions of Linux and everybody's good. There's no problems left because everything's good, right? Many hosts were patched quickly, but unfortunately, of course, many were not. Lots of people have hosts that are running legacy code that they say, oh, we can't patch the kernel, you know, and the security guys will say, you've got to patch the kernel because the hackers are in there. And they say, look, the hackers are already in there. It's okay. The kernel's running fine. We can't update that. It's no problem, right? But that may not really be the case. Of course, this is considered a lower severity problem because it's only privilege escalation. I mean, who could ever use privilege escalation? Nobody could ever get an account on these machines in the first place to elevate their privileges. Yeah, they could, right? So the question is, how long will this last? And problems like this typically persist for many, many years. MS-08 067, which most of you know about, still persists 9 years after its release. Of course, there is, I guess most of the systems that would be exploited by this are no longer even supported, and nobody's running them anymore in theory. But as late as October last year, I had penetration testers say, "Oh yeah, I popped some boxes with MS-08067 just the other day." And so these problems persist long, long, long after they should, and that's just the way it goes. And I don't know of a way to fix that. I don't know of anybody who does. That's just life. So I do have a large number of links for those who are interested in any of the things that I talked about, whether they are the reports of the original discovery or of the remediation. And I'll go back after this is over to the original page so you can look at the site where you can download these slides if you don't want to take a picture of these links that are extremely ridiculously long. So with that, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. You've got a question.
I know the main issue with the copy on write was basically gaining access or escalating privileges. Besides just escalating privileges, were there any other like giant flags that they took out?
With the copy on write?
Yeah.
So the question is, besides escalating privileges, are there any other giant issues or things that you might look for that could enable, right? So anything that you could do as a result of writing to a file that you shouldn't be able to write to is essentially the answer to that, because that is the thing that this allows. So if you can imagine anything you could do, and I can't imagine anything worse than being able to pop a root shell, because that sort of enables a lot of other things. But you might be able to find more nefarious approaches to solving problems. For example, you might be able to modify a program that is set user root that has some benign behavior, and therefore you could avoid getting logging associated with code that you're writing, so that you could do you could essentially put sort of a mini user space rootkit into an otherwise reasonable program like user bin password, so that you can say, oh well, I'm just resetting my password. Yeah, but it all gets down to anything you can do as a result of writing a file you shouldn't be able to write. Other questions? Any questions of any kind? Well, if there are no more, thank you very much for your attention. All right. I will just go back to page 1. Put that thing up there. So. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. All right. Let me take this off.